So spring's finally arrived, which is great because it's been a really long winter with lockdown and everything. And with our 1 hour allocated exercise time, Rochelle and I went for a walk and it was great. There was all the flowers were blooming and all this sort of stuff. And Rochelle did this thing. I always think this is kind of cute. She gathers like wildflowers and makes like a bunch for at home. So cut to a few days later, I'm looking at this bunch of wattles and I'm wondering what one of those little orange puffballs actually looks like under the microscope. So I put it under the microscope and I'm wrestling it into position, and it's kind of difficult because everything you do under the microscope is magnified. But I finally get it in position and I sort of step back and have a look at it. Then I realize that this thing's moving by itself. There's about 3 little yellow bugs that live in there that you would never notice. And then I'm thinking, hang on, there's about 1,000 of those flowers just sitting in that vase right over there. But look, maybe that tree had an infestation or something, I don't know. But it did get me thinking about pollen. Now, I wanted to look at pollen with this microscope, and you can see it as little tiny grains, but you can't actually see the shapes of them. But then I was chatting to a friend of mine from down the back, and it turns out that she has a microscope as well. It's like, hey, doesn't everyone? And she very generously agreed to lend it to me. So huge shout out to you, Andrea. Thank you so much. I'm going to show you the difference. This is my stereo microscope, and this is the beast. Now you can see this is a much more complicated machine. It's got a lot more knobs and things I won't go into, but it magnifies a lot more, which is the main thing. So I went out into the garden and I gathered as many different types of flowers as I could. So I've brought them all back and I've lined them all up, and I'm looking at ways to extract the pollen from them under the stereo microscope. And that's when I realized that every single one of those flowers had some kind of a bug in it. You know, whether it was an aphid or there was a caterpillar or a spider or whatever that is. Every single one. It wasn't just the wattle. If you look closely enough, you will find a bug on anything that's outdoors. So I'm really sorry if I've managed to completely ruin wildflowers for anyone out there, but I think that's just the way the world is. Anyway, sorry. So I did get some pollen under the microscope, and it was kind of interesting. I mean, I found 3 main sort of shapes. There was little coffee beans, and there were other ones that were kind of more sort of round, and then there were other ones that were kind of like little pineapples. And the cool thing about pollen is that when it comes into contact with water, it kind of almost immediately expands and blows up. It's like a ball inflating. You can see that here where you've got sort of the edge of the water just touching the pollen, and as it sort of creeps across, the pollen sort of hits it and then just, puffs up. So that's really interesting. But last episode there was a creature that I wasn't quite able to identify, and my book has since arrived, so I can identify it now. And it's called a Chaetogaster annelid. I think I'm saying that right. But the most interesting thing about these guys is that they have all their reproductive strategies covered. They're hermaphrodites, like the earthworms that they're related to, but usually they reproduce asexually, which means that essentially they just grow longer and longer and longer until the second half of them develops into an independent creature that buds off and then goes its own separate way. And there's a whole horror story right there when you think about it, because there is a period of time where the gastric tract goes right through both creatures continuously, and that's a human centipede thing right there, which we won't go into. But next week, I've noticed that part of my 5K radius includes the beach, and all the water samples I've looked at so far have been pond water, things that aren't linked to a larger ecosystem. So I'm really excited to take some samples from the ocean and see what kind of diversity I can find in there. So I hope you join me then. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.